Power speaks most clearly when it declares itself untouchable. When a vice president says a federal officer has absolute immunity, the room goes cold. Not because the law is settled, but because the verdict seems pre-written. In Minneapolis, a woman named Renee Nicole Good was shot in her car. Within hours, the nation was told accountability did not apply. Absolute is a dangerous word in a system built on limits. American law rarely offers shields without conditions or scrutiny. Immunity, when it exists, is argued, tested, and judged. If you care about how power is restrained, stay with me, because this case is not about a slogan or a speech. It is about who decides the rules when force is used. It is about whether reasonableness is examined or assumed, and it is about the quiet machinery that moves cases away from daylight. To understand that machinery, we must first define the problem precisely. Only then can we see what is truly at stake. The legal question here is narrower than the political noise surrounding it. It is not whether federal officers can ever be prosecuted by states. It is when, how, and by whom that judgment is made. The vice president framed immunity as automatic and absolute. Experts say the law does not work that way. Federal officers are not above criminal law by default. They operate inside a system of layered authority. States retain power to enforce their criminal statutes. The federal government retains power to protect its agents. Those two forces collide in moments like this. When they do, the battlefield becomes procedural, not rhetorical. The fight shifts to jurisdiction, timing, and evidentiary control. An officer can claim their actions were part of official duties. That claim opens doors rather than closing them. It invites judicial scrutiny instead of ending the case. What follows is not immunity in theory, but immunity in practice. And practice depends on facts, access, and who controls the process. Before we examine that process, we need to understand where it came from. The conflict between state prosecution and federal authority is not new. It stretches back more than a century into American constitutional law. Courts developed what is known as supremacy clause immunity. The idea was simple but cautious. Federal officials should not be punished by states for carrying out federal law. But that protection was never meant to be automatic. It was designed as a shield, not a blank check. Over time, courts added conditions. An officer had to be acting within official duties. And even then, the conduct had to be reasonable. That second requirement changed everything. Reasonableness forced courts to look at facts, not titles. It tied immunity to behavior, not authority. This framework evolved alongside modern policing and federal expansion. As federal agencies grew, so did the stakes of immunity claims. Every case became a balancing act between order and accountability. Too much protection risks impunity. Too little risks paralyzing enforcement. That tension sits at the heart of today's dispute, and it leads directly to the first breaking point in this case. The first rupture did not happen in a courtroom. It happened at the scene itself, and then in the hours after, federal officials described Renee Nicole Good as a rioter. They said she used her vehicle against officers enforcing immigration law. That framing traveled fast through official channels. It suggested threat, urgency, and justification. But 3 videos reviewed later showed something more complicated. Not chaos, but ambiguity. Not certainty, but moments open to interpretation. This is where cases are often won or lost. Because immunity does not attach to narratives. It attaches to facts, and facts require access. Local investigators expected to jointly examine the shooting. They were blocked from participating by federal authorities. That decision shocked Minnesota officials. It also changed the trajectory of the case. Without evidence, scrutiny stalls. If transparency matters to you, stay with me. Because what looks like procedure may be the real power. To see why, we have to examine the mechanism beneath the standoff. Beneath the headlines lies a hidden mechanism of legal power. Federal officers can raise immunity claims in court. But the process is not automatic or simple. It begins with a two-step judicial analysis. First, the court asks, was the officer acting within official duties? That bar is intentionally low. Second, the court asks, were the officer's actions reasonable given the circumstances? Reasonableness is measured against what a trained officer could perceive in the moment. It is not subjective opinion. It is fact-bound inquiry. Witnesses, videos, and other evidence are gathered to evaluate that question. Even small discrepancies can tilt the balance between accountability and immunity. The law recognizes that split-second decisions occur under pressure, but it also recognizes the need for oversight. This mechanism shows that immunity is procedural, not absolute. It is a safeguard, not a guarantee. It demonstrates why the federal versus state clash is more than politics. It is about who controls facts, interpretation, and ultimately justice. And it sets the stage for the second crisis in this story. Tensions escalated again, this time in the court of public perception. Footage circulated, raising questions about what truly happened in the car. Renee Nicole Good's death became a symbol, a lightning rod for protests nationwide. Federal officials maintained she posed a threat. Community leaders and witnesses described a more nuanced scene. Voices clashed over truth, narrative, and authority. Local investigators remained sidelined, blocked from gathering evidence firsthand. The absence of full transparency fueled suspicion and anger. Every news cycle added pressure. Every statement sharpened divisions. Political leaders weighed in, framing the event in starkly different terms. The nation watched as procedural rules collided with raw human emotion. It became clear that this was no ordinary investigation. The stakes were both symbolic and tangible, touching every layer of governance. Accountability was questioned, while power asserted itself with formal declarations. And in this tension, the law's mechanisms were tested in real time. How reasonableness would be judged hung in the balance. The second crisis was not only legal but deeply social. It revealed that enforcement, perception, and justice are inseparable. And it brings us to the human cost at the center of this storm. For Renee Nicole Good, and for every family watching from their living rooms, this is not abstract law. It is the sharp edge of policy hitting flesh and blood. You feel the fear of being judged in an instant. You feel the frustration when systems meant to protect seem to block you instead. Communities wonder if their lives are valued equally under the law. Questions of fairness and accountability are not academic, they are lived experiences. And in Minneapolis, the absence of local investigative access amplifies that fear. Residents see conflicting narratives. Federal officials call one thing, videos show another. The tension lands hardest on those already wary of authority. You, the viewer, are forced to confront your own trust in the system, because when facts are withheld, imagination fills the gaps and anger grows. This is where law meets humanity, where policy meets people, where decisions made in seconds ripple across entire neighborhoods. If you care about accountability, you must care about access, transparency, and evidence. Empathy is not optional. It is essential to understanding the stakes. And what you feel is precisely what courts must eventually weigh. This moment humanizes the abstract debate over immunity and reasonableness. The reverberations of this case extend far beyond Minneapolis. What happens here matters to every jurisdiction balancing federal and state authority. Other states watch closely, taking note of how immunity claims are tested. Federal agencies nationwide see the stakes in how local investigators are included or blocked. The tension between transparency and control becomes a template for future incidents. Internationally, allies observe how the United States enforces law within its borders. Questions arise about consistency, accountability, and human rights. Immigration enforcement, already under scrutiny, now faces an intensified spotlight. Policy debates at the national level gain texture from this single event. Courts in other states may reference outcomes here when adjudicating similar disputes. Civil liberties groups amplify concerns, framing the case as emblematic of systemic issues. Media coverage shapes public perception, feeding feedback loops that affect policy and enforcement. Investigation procedures, the definition of reasonableness, and claims of immunity are all under scrutiny. Every decision made here can influence legislation, oversight, and training across the country. Even federal morale and internal procedures shift subtly in response to public reaction. The Minneapolis incident becomes a lens for systemic analysis, not just an isolated tragedy. And as we consider global ripples, we must ask, what futures are we shaping? Looking ahead, the trajectory of this case can unfold in three ways. In the best-case scenario, transparency prevails. Investigators gain full access to evidence, witness testimony, and video. Courts carefully evaluate the officer's actions against reasonableness. Accountability is clear, and the law functions as intended. Trust in institutions is strengthened, and communities feel heard. Federal and state authorities learn to coordinate effectively. The narrative becomes one of justice, not impunity. In a middle scenario, partial access limits scrutiny. Some evidence is available, but gaps remain. Courts struggle to reach a definitive conclusion. Public perception remains divided, and protests linger. Policies are adjusted incrementally, but systemic questions persist. Tension between federal and state authorities continues. Lessons are learned, but slowly and unevenly. In the worst-case scenario, access is denied entirely. Procedural shields overshadow facts. Federal claims of immunity go unchallenged. Public outrage intensifies, but legal consequences are minimal. Trust erodes, and communities feel alienated. The case becomes a symbol of unaccountable power. The long-term impact ripples across law enforcement, policy, and society. Each scenario reminds us law is not static. It is a reflection of human judgment, negotiation, and restraint. And the choices made now will echo far beyond the courtroom. This case closes, but it does not end. What we have seen in Minneapolis is a window into the delicate balance between authority and accountability. Absolute immunity, as claimed, is a myth. The real test lies in procedure, reasonableness, and access to facts. Federal power meets state oversight, and the outcomes ripple through communities, courts, and policy. For you, the viewer, it is a reminder that law is not abstract. It is alive, contested, and dependent on who watches, who investigates, and who judges. Every protest, every video, every statement shapes the landscape of justice. And as citizens, as observers, we hold a stake in that system. Ask yourself, are we content to accept declarations of untouchability? Or will we insist on scrutiny, transparency, and accountability? The answers to these questions will shape not just one case, but the future of law enforcement nationwide. Stay informed, stay engaged, because vigilance is the only way to ensure that justice is more than a word. And as this chapter closes, another begins. The next challenge for law, policy, and society is already unfolding. Your attention, your questioning, and your insistence on truth matter. The story is not over, and neither is the fight for accountability.